Everything I'm looking at here for sale, or
a lot of stuff is for sale.
Frank Fritz from the History Channel's reality series American Pickers has died.
it's in great condition, and what the seller is when Francis wound it up, and it did the full circle right in front of me. He had me at the first lap.
He felt really, really bad. You'd go to see him in the nursing home, and how you doing, Frank? And one half of his body was completely done, and he'd lift his arm up and it just dropped. Well, that's got to be tough, to be totally bedridden.
Well, today, friends and fans of American Pickers star Frank Fritz gathered to honor his legacy in a very special way. KWQC's Wafa Ezit takes us to the dedication in Savannah, Illinois, where Fritz's spirit is alive and well.
According to Frank Fritz's longtime friend, Frank lost the will to live a long time ago. Even 2 years after his death, many details about his final years remain unknown. The battles he faced before his illness, the legal war between his father and his friends over his will, his rocky relationship with Mike Wolfe, and an unexpected obsession with cats have surfaced. But what do these reveal about the man behind American Pickers? And was his loss of will only due to sickness, or were other factors involved? Join us as we tell the untold story, from Frank Fritz's earliest days as a collector to the final legacy he left behind. How Frank lost the will to live. For years, Frank Fritz was known as the easygoing half of American Pickers, a man who could walk into an old barn, spot something everyone else had overlooked, and somehow turn it into rusty gold. But behind that relaxed television persona, Frank had spent much of his adult life dealing with problems that rarely got talked about on screen. One of the biggest was Crohn's disease. Frank had battled the condition for more than 30 years, dealing with painful and unpredictable symptoms that made his everyday life difficult. Even before his final years, there were periods when he would retreat to his Iowa farmhouse and isolate himself when his health became particularly bad. His problems became more complicated as he got older. Shortly before leaving American Pickers, Frank underwent major back surgery that required 2 rods to be placed in his spine and more than 180 stitches. He spent time in rehabilitation afterward, where he also worked to confront his problems with alcohol. Unlike his illness, which could be hidden in a retreat to Iowa, his addiction was impossible to hide. In 2017, Frank was arrested after driving the wrong way on an Iowa interstate. He admitted to police that he had consumed alcohol along with Xanax before getting behind the wheel. He would later spend 77 days in an Iowa rehabilitation facility, explaining that his drinking had spiraled after the closely timed deaths of his mother and grandfather, both of whom had struggled with alcohol-related problems. Then there were the problems in his personal life. In early 2020, his former fiancée, Diane Bankson, filed a lawsuit alleging that Frank had been drinking with a friend at his Iowa farmhouse when a firework exploded inside a vintage ash bucket, leaving her with serious burns. Diane also accused him of infidelity and manipulation. She eventually dismissed the lawsuit, but the episode added another layer of turmoil for Frank during an already difficult period. And Frank's health, unforgivingly, would eventually become far more serious than any of those problems. In July 2022, he suffered a devastating stroke that left him with permanent physical limitations. The stroke paralyzed the right side of his body, making him dependent on others for even basic tasks. He eventually became wheelchair-bound and, according to his longtime friend Jerry Jandro, spent his final years bedridden in a nursing home, unable to lift his own arm. Shortly after Frank's death, Jerry spoke publicly about just how much those limitations and all that had happened before had affected him. He said Frank felt really, really bad about his condition and believed that he had lost the will to live. For someone who had spent decades traveling, searching through garages, climbing around barns, and working with his hands, Losing that independence felt like the worst thing ever. Jerry also said Frank was anxious and restless, always trying to skip treatment and head back to work. He missed checking into work and appearing on American Pickers, but his physical condition didn't allow it. By the time Frank entered hospice care in Davenport, Iowa, he was dealing with the lasting effects of the stroke, along with serious underlying health problems. His death certificate listed the late effects of a cerebral infarction as his primary cause of death, with cerebral vascular disease contributing to the stroke. It also revealed aortic stenosis and chronic obstructive pulmonary disease. He died on September 30th, 2024, at the age of 60. His death closed one difficult chapter. What followed was an even more public battle over everything he left behind. The legal battle over the star's will. Some of the biggest questions surrounding Frank Fritz's life only began after his death. He left behind an estate estimated at around $6 million, including his Iowa farmhouse, antique collection, motorcycles, and other valuable possessions accumulated over his decades of collecting. But instead of quietly passing it to the people Frank had chosen, his estate became the center of an increasingly bitter legal battle. At the heart of the dispute is a will that appeared in late 2023, roughly a year after Frank suffered the stroke that left him severely disabled. By that point, an Iowa judge had determined that Frank was incapacitated and unable to manage his own legal and financial affairs. His close friend Chris Davis had been appointed as his legal guardian. That timing became one of the most important issues in the case. Frank's biological father, William Bill Fritz, has challenged the will, arguing that it was fraudulent and that Frank was not mentally competent to sign it. The document was reportedly executed while Frank was under guardianship, raising questions about whether he understood what he was signing and whether his final wishes were truly his own. But Frank's friends and caretakers have strongly disputed that version of events. They argue that Frank had periods when he was mentally sharp and capable of making decisions for himself. They have also pushed back against his father's involvement, pointing to Bill's long absence from Frank's life and the limited contact between them during Frank's final years. Guardianship documents reportedly stated that Frank had no living relatives with whom he maintained contact. His father, however, maintains that the will should be thrown out and has pursued the matter through the Iowa courts. Bill Fritz has publicly challenged the will, telling the U.S. Sun, "It is a fake will. He did not have a will. He did not sign it. I am his only loved one. I am his only survivor." In this case, there was a lot more at stake than the farmhouse. Since Frank had spent decades turning his passion for collecting into an extremely valuable private inventory, he had a very large collection of motorcycles, signs, oil cans, and especially vintage toys. Unlike motorcycles, which could take up enormous amounts of space and require expensive restoration, he knew antique toys were smaller, easier to store, and could appreciate significantly in value. After his death, auctioneers sold pieces from the collection, and the money generated from some of those sales has reportedly been held in escrow while the legal dispute continues. While the fight over his will continues, another part of Frank's story remains just as unresolved: the complicated partnership that made him famous in the first place. What the American Pickers was really like. The TV deals and cameras didn't just come from nowhere. Mike Wolfe spent years pitching the idea for American Pickers to television networks, and when the opportunity finally came, he went to recruit Frank Fritz, who immediately declined. He wasn't convinced. Frank already had a stable business of his own, Frank Fritz Finds, and agreeing to join the show meant stepping away from the brick-and-mortar shop he had built around his passion for collecting. Eventually, he made the jump. In 2010, American Pickers premiered on the History Channel, turning Frank and Mike into familiar faces for millions of viewers. On screen, the two appeared to be lifelong friends who could simply climb into a van, drive through small towns, and stumble across forgotten treasures. But this wasn't quite the whole truth. Frank later revealed that the kind of spontaneous freestyle picking viewers saw on television almost disappeared after the first season. After the first season, a production team would travel ahead of the cast, researching properties, contacting owners, finding out what they were willing to sell, and scripting scenarios on what might eventually be filmed. That meant the discoveries were not random accidents. By the time Frank and Mike arrived with cameras following them, much of the groundwork had already been done. The relationship between the two men was also more complicated than the show suggested. Although Frank and Mike had known each other since middle school, Frank later admitted that they were never particularly close friends before American Pickers. Their partnership became extremely successful, but the friendship viewers saw on television did not always reflect what was happening away from the cameras. Over time, Frank also became frustrated with how the series presented him and Mike. He believed the show was heavily tilted toward Mike, making his partner look like the central star while minimizing his own abilities as a picker. Frank later admitted in a 2021 interview, "The show is tilted towards him 1,000%. He compared their dynamic to Aerosmith, calling Mike Steven Tyler and himself the supporting act. He also felt frustration towards Mike personally. When Frank took time away from filming for his major back surgery in 2020, he claimed that Mike never called or checked on him while he was recovering. Frank said that even after he was ready to return, a showrunner contacted him on his birthday, promised to call the following day about his comeback, and then never followed up. In the end, he never returned to the television series. There were other problems behind the scenes as well. Mike Wolfe later spoke about Frank's escalating alcohol problems and the difficulties they created during production. Frank's health, addiction, and increasingly unpredictable circumstances had become difficult to separate from his career. The relationship between the two men eventually deteriorated into a very public feud. When Frank was officially gone from the show, Mike posted an emotional tribute to his former partner. But Frank did not see it that way. He publicly dismissed the message as insincere, claiming that someone else had written it, and that Mike, who had barely said anything nice to him in years, could not have done all that. There was also a financial divide behind the success. Reports about their contracts have placed Frank's pay at roughly $15,000 to $20,000 per episode, while Mike reportedly earned twice as much and also held an ownership stake connected to the show's brand and intellectual property. Frank also reportedly gave up a significant portion of his likeness rights early in the show's run, meaning the merchandise built around the American Pickers brand did not profit him in any way. For nearly 3 years, Frank and Mike fought, staying off speaking terms. Then, in 2023, that changed. Mike eventually visited Frank during his recovery. The two reportedly apologized, cried, and ended the feud just before the latter's demise. And after everything that had happened between them, their relationship had come full circle. Mike has since spoken publicly about their reconciliation, but away from the cameras and the feud, another question remains. What happened to everything Frank spent decades collecting? What happened to Frank's rusty gold? For years, viewers watched Frank Fritz walk into other people's barns, garages, and storage sheds looking for the things everyone else had forgotten. But Frank had a collection of his own, and much of it was kept far away from the cameras. His private garage was one of those places. After his death, it was opened up and revealed the kind of collection fans might have expected to see on American Pickers. Only this time, Frank was the one who had been doing the picking. Beneath dust, neon signs, and antique toys sat a carefully preserved 1957 Chevrolet Bel Air, hidden under a tarp, along with rows of vintage motorcycles, some of them sitting with flat tires. The motorcycles were particularly important to Frank. collecting them had been a lifelong obsession, and over the years he accumulated a substantial number of vintage Harley-Davidsons, Indians, and other bikes. But motorcycles weren't the only things he considered valuable. Frank also quietly built a large collection of antique toys, particularly cast iron toys. Then there was Frank Fritz Finds in Savannah, Illinois. The shop had never looked quite like the polished antique businesses viewers might have imagined. It was attached to Bufflehead's bar and grill, giving it a distinctly rough, biker-oriented atmosphere. Visitors who went there described it as an environment that could feel uncomfortable and far removed from the friendly image of American Pickers. But it wasn't. American Pickers was in one way or the other an influence on the business, and in most cases it was a negative influence. Once American Pickers became a success, Frank spent much of his time traveling for production. That meant he wasn't always around to operate the shop, and maintaining a steady inventory became difficult. Some of the best items he found could end up being used for the show or sold elsewhere, leaving the physical store struggling to keep up. After Frank's 2022 stroke made traveling impossible, there was an attempt to give the shop another purpose. Plans were made to bring some of the antiques stored in Frank's private outbuildings into the store, giving him a place where he could potentially sit, price items, and interact with visitors. It was an effort to reconnect him with the world of collecting while working within the physical limitations left by his stroke. But Frank's condition continued to deteriorate, and that plan never became the revival his friends had hoped for. In the end, they settled for a memorial store of some sort. His friends planned it as a permanent space, which will be known as the Frank Fritz Man Cave in Iowa, complete with a bar and a small theater where people could gather and share memories of him. The objects Frank spent decades collecting are now scattered across different collections, auction lots, and private hands. As the pieces of his collection scattered after his death, one thing becomes clear. Frank's story as a collector started long before American Pickers, and long before the first motorcycle. From his first collection to his final legacy. Long before Frank Fritz became a television personality, he was already a collector. As a young boy, he started with ordinary things most people would have ignored: staples, coins, stamps, and beer cans. Over time, those small collections grew into something much bigger, eventually leading him toward vintage motorcycles, antiques, and the world of picking that would define his career. But collecting wasn't Frank's first profession. For roughly 25 years, he worked as a fire and safety inspector in Iowa. The job took him into situations that were far removed from the quiet barns and antique shops viewers would eventually associate with him. He dealt with dangerous fires, chemical spills, and train derailments, witnessing the aftermath of accidents and disasters as part of his work. Eventually, picking became more than a hobby. Frank developed an especially strong connection with motorcycles and eventually accumulated a substantial collection of vintage bikes. He was also a regular at the Sturgis Motorcycle Rally, attending the event for 32 consecutive years. For someone whose television career would later revolve around forgotten machines and old Americana, motorcycles were not simply props for the show. They had been part of Frank's life long before there were cameras following him, and there was another side to Frank that television rarely showed. Away from the motorcycles, antique signs, and greasy machinery, he had a softer relationship with animals. Frank loved rescue cats and deliberately kept that part of his life away from American Pickers. Friends said he did not want the network turning his private sanctuary into another part of his television persona. He also quietly supported animal rescue organizations, revealing a side of him that was very different from the rough-and-ready picker viewers saw on screen. That contrast was part of what made Frank so recognizable. He could spend years searching for valuable antiques, build a successful television career around them, and still remain attached to the small, ordinary things that had fascinated him as a child. But the final chapter of his life was defined less by what he collected and more by what he had lost. After his stroke, Frank could no longer travel the country and freely look after cats. But at least it brought about a better ending to his friendship with Mike Wolfe. When Frank entered hospice care in Davenport, Iowa, Mike was eventually there with him. Mike later described sitting beside Frank during his final moments, holding his hand and trying to comfort him as his breathing became more difficult. The boy who once collected stamps, coins, and beer cans spent his life turning forgotten objects into something valuable. He became a fire inspector, a picker, a businessman, and a television personality, but none of those roles completely explained who he was. For fans, he will probably always be remembered walking through an old barn with Mike Wolfe, looking past the dust and rust for something worth saving. But Frank's real legacy is larger than American pickers. It lives in the motorcycles and antiques he collected, the people who knew him away from television, the animals he quietly cared for, and the countless viewers who loved watching him find beauty and value in things other people had left behind. Do you think Frank Fritz ever truly found peace before he died? Or did the weight of his health, the legal burdens, and the loss of independence take that from him for good? And do you think the reconciliation with Mike Wolfe was enough to give him peace? Or did too much damage remain? Share your thoughts with us in the comments section. Remember to like, share, and subscribe for more. Also, click the next video showing on your screen. You will enjoy it.